Hello, today I'm going to talk about the novel Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen in 1813. The central theme of the novel is the romantic relationships of main heroes, Miss Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Although Elizabeth is convinced that her opinions are formed as a result of deliberate rational thinking, she seems to be an extremely emotionally driven person. And first of all, after her conversation with Mr. Wickham, Elizabeth was convinced that Mr. Darcy deserves to be publicly disgraced. Then she retold the particulars of her meeting with Mr. Wickham to Jane, and Jane was convinced that this was not possible. And Jane recommended Elizabeth not to draw conclusions because this situation might have been caused by blame from both sides, not only from uh, Darcy's side. And Elizabeth responds to Jane's suggestion by arguing that she is sure that Wickham did not invent the story. And Elizabeth claims that there was a truth in his look. And from this episode, we may think of Elizabeth as a character who is convinced that she acts rationally, but as readers, we observe weak logical connections in her reasoning. We rather see her compassion to the feelings of Mr. Wickham, who, according to his own words, was a victim of very proud Mr. Darcy. Up until receiving the marriage proposal followed by the letter from Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth could not even think that she became the subject of Mr. Darcy's interest. And later in the novel, when Elizabeth visits Mr. Darcy's estate in Pemberley, we observe from free indirect discourse the transformations of Elizabeth's feelings to Mr. Darcy. She now feels respect uh, and gratitude towards Mr. Darcy for loving her when she precipitously drew conclusions about his personality. And starting from the moment of epiphany, when she realizes how much she loves Mr. Darcy, we as readers may expect um, expect her to become more rational person. However, she seems to preserve her emotional character even at the very end of the novel. We again face with her extreme emotionality in the episode of her conversation with her father, when he was surprised that Elizabeth uh, is going to marry a person who seemed to be very proud and unpleasant sort of man. She replied with tears in her eyes that she loved Mr. Darcy. Moreover, she asked her father not to speak about Mr. Darcy in such terms. And these moments, as well as letters that appear in the text, give this novel the feeling of sentimentalism. Elizabeth's emotionality and her instances when her feelings were described in the form of free indirect discourse allow the readers to vicariously undergo the feelings of the heroes, to emphasize them. And such literary technique makes this novel unique because Jane Austen was one of the pioneers who used free indirect discourse as a style of narration. And if we look to this novel from the definition of the novel as a genre, we notice that this novel indeed has seductive proximity to the real world. However, some of the actions that take place in the novel may not necessarily happen in the real life. For example, it was rare that, for example, people from completely different classes would possibly meet. And Jane Austen introduced Mr. and Mrs. Gardiners, who are distinguished by highly refined manners, to serve as a bridge between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. As a result, it's difficult to classify this novel as a realistic one, and instead I would classify this novel to romantic to romanticism novels, because first it was written in the middle of romanticism period, and secondly because this novel prioritizes inner lives of people by free indirect discourse. And the last important point that I want to mention is that it's surprising that author of this brilliant novel never married. However, her work may suggest that this did not prevent her to dream about the perfect relationships, and most importantly, her profound understanding of the psychology of relationships.